there's no opposite audience members.
Alright, you know what? I actually shouldn't say anything, yeah.
That's on you. That's on you. All right.
Sorry guys, I'm really old.
Yeah. And now that's all recorded. Prime Minister, when you're ready to begin.
Yeah, where's the transfer? Oxford! Yeah, we go.
This really goes against my better judgment, but I have to say, I can't think of a more perfect motion than Hans and I. Voting out would be incredibly simple. We will prove why the Ensmutification of mainstream media in particular is necessary to change important norms surrounding sex and sexuality, and why the alternatives, which are not mainstream and generally are far worse, at doing the same and often lead to far more aggressive sexual norms. So first, what is the Ensmutification? As the info slide suggests, it is the explicit depiction of sex and sexuality within mainstream media, so this is literal sex scenes and nudity. Secondly, it also inevitably, as a consequence of the fact that these sex scenes exist in these movies, shifts the thematic focus of these movies towards discussions of sex and sexuality. Like, look at the examples in the info slide, right? It's not like sex happens and there's like a totally unrelated story. There are some action movies like that, but Ensmutification is surely something further than this, right? It's also about mainstream conversations about, for example, growing up in like the sexual revolution, the days of Euphoria, and how like teenagers are becoming like acclimatized to this new adult world of sex and sexuality. It's about things like abuse and exploitation. It's about misogynistic dynamics in movies like Wuthering Heights, which perhaps at the time of the novel people didn't understand, but as the critical audience now, people can interrogate either as ordinary audiences or as critics. So obviously this is like a wide thematic focus on Ensmutification, but the prerequisite to this is there has to be sex, right? Otherwise there's nothing to discuss. There has to be nudity. Otherwise there's nothing to really get people to watch it in the first place, or really spur people to think about this not just as like an ordinary relationship dynamic, but something that's specifically focused on sex, right? The plenty of shows about teenage relationships, but the sexual component is what Euphoria focuses on particularly, and that's what leads to new kinds of exploitations, like sexual exploitation between new teenagers and older adults, which is far worse than just having a relationship, for instance. So all of that is unique to Ensmutification. I'll be clear, because the info slide says that Ensmutification is about depictions of sex in mainstream media. Any depiction of sex in mainstream media that follows what I've just discussed is only something that we can claim on garbage. So opposition has to support either non-mainstream alternatives of sex, or they have to depict relationships that are totally sanitized and don't have any sexual element. We prove that both of those cover. The first argument, no, thank you. Why is it important? Why is important change in sexual norms only possible outside of the house? The first learning here is why alternatives of explicit depictions of sex are far worse. First, I just want to clarify, people have a strong desire to seek out explicit descriptions of sex and sexuality on both sides of the house, because humans have natural sex, right? And many young people are naturally curious. Sex isn't something that's openly discussed because there's a general taboo against it. You like culture and religion, and so you see this in mainstream media, particularly in developing countries, right, where the stigma is even stronger. What are the alternatives available to people? The first and most obvious is pornography. The second, in cases where pornography is highly stigmatized, are turning to your family or peer group, for example, so the boys. These are likely, first, because pornography is like a massive industry that advertises, there's like a massive online presence, and it's incredibly easy to access. And if the alternative is that porn is highly stigmatized, you grow up like extremely conservative, believing it's the same, the only alternative available to you are like religious narratives espoused by your parents or talking to your friends and peers. Why are all of these far, far worse? There are two big reasons here. The first is there's significantly less scrutiny on both of these alternatives than there is on the mainstream media. Watching porn is highly stigmatized, which means no one's willing to talk about it, right? Like, raise your hands if you watch porn, guys. Yeah. But this didn't have no shame, but most people don't discuss this. But secondly, great. Tanush and Max with their hands. That's exactly the point, right? Like, boys might be willing to talk about it because it's like bro conversation, right? But you don't get like cross-group interactions, right? Like, far fewer women are watching porn or willing to accept it, willing to openly say that they're watching porn. But in the cases where they are engaging with like Ensmutified content, it's significantly more different, right? It's like YA novels or like written text because they have like different biological desires. So for that reason, you just don't get the kind of cross-pollination between groups that you would get with mainstream media either. I want this means is you might suspect that porn is unrealistic, right? Most of us probably do. But it's very difficult, like if you have a virgin, if you have little sexual experience, to conceptualize what the alternative is. And that's when, with no alternative present, either you sort of like you track away from sex, you think less about it. So eventually, when you're in a relationship, you are the behest and mercy, for example, of your older, more experienced partner, of your male partner, for example, that is willing to be more assertive in that relationship. So it's the lack of an alternative, and the lack of an alternative that is a consequence of a lack of scrutiny that's particularly bad. The second is, and this deals charitably, generously with opposition bench, right? Let's assume that they have depictions of relationships but without sex. They say that takes care of all of the issues with these power dynamics. The problem is, if you never talk about the sexual dimension of these relationships, then there are specific norms about sex that are never discussed, that you leave up to people's like blind judgment. For example, is sex an expectation in relationships, or is it actually something that needs to be courted? Is consent something for sex in particular that should be assumed in the same way that we assume it for other like romantic gestures that are not necessarily sexual? Obviously not, right? Like the dynamics differ because sex is something that's particularly important that ought to be more sensitive about. But when people generalize from norms surrounding romantic relationships, you get those kinds of harmful generalizations. Now, why are mainstream depictions of sexuality better? I've already addressed the point of sexuality, so I just want to point out people are far more willing to openly have conversations about it. In a way that they will never be about porn because the stigma is so deeply entrenched in the indoctrinated mind.
For Wuthering Heights or Euphoria, to satisfy the same desire porn does for you right now, what characteristics does it need to have?
I have personal questions. It's not just the biological desire, right? It's also the curiosity that I talked about and the lack of experience that people tend to. Like, that's part of the reason why we watch porn, probably, right? The second reason is the sheer quantity of people engaging with mainstream media, right? Like, Wuthering Heights isn't just big in like the Western world, it's very in the developing world, right? It's even on like young teenagers as well. So the sheer scope of people talking about this online means that you generalize towards norms that are more socially acceptable. And in particular, you get the kind of cross-pollination, right? Like men and women both watch mainstream media in a way that they don't watch the same kinds of porn, and so they can have discussions together about it. Then I just think that there are structural reasons why, given the entertainment industry, these depictions will be good. Trends in recent years of how filmmakers have realized that there's this untapped female viewership, which is why they're making movies like Wuthering Heights in the first place that center female protagonists. Second, women are far better represented in the entertainment industry than they are in the porn industry, right? They actually like are script writers and directors. The Me Too movement has happened, and defense of that, the platforming of directors like Greta Gerwig, of actresses like Margot Robbie, depictions that focus on the female perspective are how I like it. There's very little porn that focuses on the female perspective that is consumed by men, right? Which is what would be necessary in this case. So, what does this mean? Now we can see that porn still exists on our side of the house. Your peer group still exists. Thank God, right? The presence of an alternative, the capacity to have these conversations is a significant and meaningful margin. You doubt what you see in pornography. You believe that your family might be lying to you and they're religious, but you can only act on that doubt on our side of the house.
I thank the Prime Minister for those remarks. I now invite the Leader of Opposition.
Oxford! Get ready.
Interestingly, in high school English class, I never read Wuthering Heights, but the only thing I know about Wuthering Heights now is apparently there's a lot of sex in it. I also know that Teaser Rivalry is about hockey, and there's also a lot of sex in that. But the extent of my engagement with these things is just limited to this. And that, I think, encapsulates why the Ensmutification of content is bad. Is instead of having actual stories that underlie it, the focus of the entire show becomes about the smut, becomes about the sex, and we think that is incredibly harmful. I'm going to do two things in speech. First, I'll demonstrate why this content is poorly created and is therefore harmful, which takes out the premise that those released for the case to work. I'll secondly explain why it's actually bad for social progress, unlike what they said. Few things I'm framing for this. The first thing I would say is that this debate about Ensmutification So, contrary to what Chanidu tells you, it is not the case that we have to defend a world in which every single piece of media is sterilized. Obviously, you can still have sex in shows. It just means that you can't have it centered thematically around this much. The second thing I would say is that this debate primarily takes place in Western context in the way that art is created, which is most of the art that is in Spotify will come out of Western context for a few reasons. The first is just cultural norms. I think if you tried to do this in some place like China, you'd actually just get like fucking killed or something. Like, even though by the government suppressing you, like people's parents will also kill you. So I don't think that these people like engage with this. And what this explains is the type of content is likely to be made in very Western, Hollywood-dominated areas. I'm going to explain to you all the classic reasons why Hollywood is bad, but also explain why it's particularly bad in Ensmutification. First, I recommend then on why the content is harmful. There are two parts to this argument. The first explains why content is badly created. The second part explains why even if it is well created in the way that OG characterizes it, it's still going to be harmful to people. First question then, the first question I think is why sex portrays value when it's created by these individuals. First, who creates this art? The first thing I'll note here is still likely to be the same institutionalized Hollywood structures that OG tries to run away from. There are a couple of reasons for this. The first thing I'll say is, despite OG's claim that there are more like women or whatever in Hollywood now, that still pales in comparison to the entrenched structures that still exist. Obviously, things like protests against like men and white people being in Hollywood continue to this day. And that's just because there are a lot of entrenched reasons, like, for example, family lineages, working in the media industry, which is often very close. That means that a lot of this content is still dominated by the same individuals. There are very significant problems with this. What this means is the same types of people who created all the bad content that Hollywood represented other things in history are also the ones who are going to be poorly representing sex. There's another significant reason here, and that is that sex sells, which means that when you Ensmutified content, the impetus is to put more and more smart into your shows so they become more and more appealing. If Chanidu's case is that this is better because people watch it because they like porn, what that explains to you is the incentive to put more and more porn into these shows. That doesn't do any of the relationship building conversation that they want to talk about. Instead, they're talking about like, wow, what a fun love triangle in like, I forgot the Zendaya show. I really don't know these shows. What that means is, when you make sex the dominant narrative in these shows, you focus attention away from the other aspects of these shows that are good. Chanidu said, Euphoria said that show about teenage sex and like the other stuff, right? I would just posit that the teenage sex stuff dominated over the other stuff, and then, like the narrative say about addiction, like and the difficulty of addiction, just get overshadowed by this. In order for OG's claim to work, they have to actually demonstrate that the sex is portrayed well in a way that actually sparks conversation as opposed to detracts from it. We would just suggest that their own framing means that this is unlikely. The second part, I would say, the second reason I think this is just bad is because the type of art is likely to filled with the same types of conventionally attractive people, and that means two things. The first thing is that not everyone will be able to identify with these shows, and as the more and more you thematically focus things like movies about love on the sex aspect, and the more and more you focus on specific sets of people having access to this sex, that is the point at which you recharacterize the conversation about those people being more deserving of these things. Now, I will just note, Chanidu says that things being mainstream is better because it means that people have conversations about it. But I'll just flip this to say, things being mainstream also means that this becomes the perceived norm for how things operate. Like, sex is taboo, porn is taboo in society, to an extent, and we think that is fine to the extent that it means that people engage with these conversations in different ways, always talking about sex. The next thing I would say is that it's still likely to be, like, for example, white people that are parts of these shows for a couple of reasons. The first reason is, in most societies, people like Asian people or other cultures have more preference against things like being naked on like film and TV. I think some things are going to scam you out of this, but like people's parents exist, and people's parents are very unhappy if you were naked on film, and I think that happens more information. What this all explains to you is the type of content that's likely to create is very like one-sided and not representative of most people, and that would think the type of content is bad. But then, why even if this content is created well, is it still harmful? The first thing I would say is that the focus that these shows put on sex overemphasizes this aspect of relationship, and we think that's very harmful. The way in which these shows work is that the side story is often put to the side.
Point speaker.
Yeah, sure.
If this content is so poorly produced, why did people enjoy and watch shows like Euphoria?
Because I don't know, because other people watch it. Like, I didn't watch it. You guys I would say that many people also don't watch these shows. Okay, why is it still about people's self-perception? The first thing I want to say is that being mainstream isn't necessarily a good thing if you're talking about these conversations. Because, like, who are the actual actors of Wuthering Heights? I think one of them was Jake and the other was like Margot Robbie or something. And both of these people, to my knowledge, I'm sorry guys, I'm so not blessed. Both these people, to my knowledge, are very conventionally attractive, white, skinny individuals. And those are just the people who get platform, because if Chanidu is right, and this is about, like, this is about making money, and this is about refocusing narratives, the most successful way for people are creating this art, then you're just going to create the art that sells most, which that's incredibly harmful for people's self-perception. All this to explain to you, content is not well created. OG actually needs to prove that it wants to access their benefits. Otherwise, I would just say we're normalizing more porn, and I think that's bad. The second argument I want to make here is why this holds on the social progress that Chanidu talks about. The first, I think it changes the narrative about what this is meant to do. That is, a lot of the narratives say around female liberation were about taking back control of your body and not being beholden to, say, other people's perceptions of it. The moment at which you Ensmutified content is the moment when bodies become re-commoditized. That's when Sydney Sweeney goes from someone who's seen as being allied to the movement to someone who is just talking about for her looks, is just platform saying with that Great Jeans campaign. That we think is very harmful, because what it does is it normalizes the re-commodification of individual bodies. That is literally what smart is, right? And to the extent that this becomes as mainstream as like modern mass media makes it, we think that's very harmful for the types of conversations that people are likely to have. Guys, I remind you again, I've never read Wuthering Heights, but now I don't have any reason to want to, because I think it's perceived as just that show about a relationship with a lot of sex in it. Chanidu, you're smiling at me. Is that the social progress that OG wants to prove needs to actually be proven? We think it's just far worse for most.
I thank the leader of for those remarks. I now invite the Deputy Prime Minister. Just because he's brown?
Whoa. What do you mean, Chanidu?
Good. There you are.
So I think the fundamental problem with opening opposition is they're incredibly uncompetitive, right? Because I have seen Ensmutification happen in my lifetime. Seriously, right? Like when I was an 11-year-old in 2017, going to like a admittedly like very privileged English medium school media. What sort of media were like boys like me and boys like Chanidu, I would assume, centered around sex? Because newsflash, guys, young people are horny and young people have access to the internet on both sides of the house. Given that Ensmutification wasn't happening in mainstream media, it wasn't that we were like nice little coy children, right? No, we were like watching and consuming really, really bad forms of porn and smut in like dark little corners of the internet that we didn't talk about. And that's the actual comparative this way, which leads to things like inside culture formats, which leads to far worse commodification of women. So I think we flipped the vast majority of impacts to opening opposition runs. I win. 3 things. First, I'm going to talk about the comparative and weigh the harms that Chanidu gives you to win. Second, I'm going to explain what our counterfactual actually is and why things will be done better than what they say. And thirdly and finally, I'm going to have 2 independent claims. One on enjoyment and second on what people see in media. Firstly, then, what's the comparative? I think Chanidu tells you 2 things. They are very simple. First comparative is porn, for all the reasons that Chanidu has already told you. But I want to critically note that the problem with porn is that porn is specifically unrealistic because it is tailored towards nothing but the way sex desires of the audience. That is to say, you want to get in like a short clip of like just like mindless sex, and this is often very objectifying and done in very, very bad ways because there are not many checks and balances on porn, unlike mainstream scrutiny and like outcry against feminists that would happen in a movie that screams very widely, for example. But the critical thing about porn is when teenage boys watch porn, as I tell you, they either talk about it with their friends or they don't talk about it at all. But critically, the people they're not talking about the porn to are, say, the women they know in their lives, their sisters, their mothers, their female friends at school. This is the kind of cross-pollination that doesn't occur when you watch porn, mainly because, like, one, for the vast majority of like time that porn has existed, it is primarily been male-catered because of misogyny and patriarchy. But second, even after like a female porn market emerged, it soon turned out that because of like decades of men being fed very unrealistic sex expectations to male dominate to like porn for men, the porn that women actually want is very different. So there's a very limited amount of like cross pollination in terms of that discourse. But second, I want to note that even if we take them at their best and say that there are certain depictions of sex in movies, within the depiction of sex in movies is actually far worse than Death in the House. I just want to think about this for a second, right? Because the commodification of women predates Ensmutification, and I would argue the commodification of women was far worse 20 to 30 years ago than it is now in a post-MeToo world. Why is this the case? Because when you're not explicitly focusing on sex as a theme, when you're not explicitly structuring your narratives and stories around sex, that is when you can get away with putting simple porn-like sex, not porn-like, but just like eye-candy sort of scenes, right? So, for example, think about how, like, in most action movies, it's just like a sex side where there's a woman who's just like a one-night stand and gets basically discarded and has no characteristics whatsoever, right? Think about like every James Bond movie you watched. Think about like Megan Fox in Transformers. Think about Top Gun, and those things still exist on that side of the house. Difference is, on our side of the house, you still get a degree of like objectification and risqué scenes, but you actually talk about the sex, what it meant for the woman, what people feel about it, and that's how you engender those conversations. So, what is then the upshot of all the analysis the channel gives you, and that I extend on? Very simple. People talk about sex far less between friend groups on their side of the house, because men watch action movies with leggy women who have no personality, and I just snap it. Or they watch porn that is incredibly unrealistic and harmful. In both cases, they don't talk about these women in their lives. Incredibly toxic cultures around sex and porn, around sex and porn, and conversations about sex and sexuality arise. This is how you get incel culture. This is how you get like very bad and aggressive attitudes towards women. This is how 21st century misogyny works. This barrier is completely broken because even the representation of that side are bad. Newsflash. If it's a blockbuster movie, it's probably the case that there are many more people seeing it, including women. I analyze how many women watch it in the first place, and why oftentimes this Ensmutification actually caters to the female and not male base. But the more people watch it, two things happen. One, even if Hollywood industry is bad, female actresses and directors have agency and can talk about themes explicitly. And this often percolates and trickles down to the women who consume their content, and they often talk about it in general social circles. But second, it is socially acceptable for you as a teenage guy to talk about like a blockbuster movie that has smutty scenes in it to women in it, right? So the way they're talking about really objectifying porn simply isn't because of social taboos and whatnot. And so as a result, you have more conversations about these movies or TV shows, and even initially you're maybe not talking about the smutty parts, you're going to talk about a movie that has like a lot of sex in it. Eventually get to the sex, right? So you have those conversations in the first place. And this is when, guys, revolutionary concept, you actually talk to people beyond your group of bros as a young man about sex, and this is when bad preconceptions about sex are often shattered. That's the comparative, that's the marginal impact on us as well. We just get far better discourse. But why will this discourse actually be done well? 5 reasons in response to what opening opposition tells us. One, it is just like not true. This is like predominantly Western. Like India is like one of the biggest markets for like a lot of like Western movies and content. Like, can you see like an item song in an Indian Bollywood movie? Like Asians actually really like movie. I know that like older Asian people, I don't know, like Chris is a boomer, maybe he doesn't. But I guarantee the vast majority of young Asian people do for the structural reasons that Chanidu do. People are curious and they like sex. Point. Secondly, even if Hollywood is institutionalized and misogynistic, the comparative is Hollywood has a far greater proportion of women working in the film industry than there are women working in the adult film industry who have the capacity to like actually shape narratives as directors and scriptwriters. So the comparative there is maybe even if like there's a degree of misogyny on both sides, it's far less in the conversation that we have on our side. Third, in many cases, you just can't put the worst and most objectifying and degrading kind of sex scenes because that's like too much for like a PG-13 audience in many cases. So it's done far more tastefully. Fourth, in many cases, fourth, in many cases, there is a massive first mover advantage which people have recognized because note this debate takes place in Egypt and in history. But post 2017, we have the Me Too movement and an acceptance that we need to fight for greater rights for women and we need to deal with like intense structures of misogyny in patriarchal society. Therefore, in correlation with women getting more votes in Hollywood for the first time in decades, some smart person realized that women are actually a massive untapped audience, and there's a massive first mover advantage to be had here. Which is why the recent rise of Ensmutification has seen movies and TV shows that are catered to the female gaze, at the centering of a female character in Wuthering Heights, for example. Fifth, if they want to talk about like conventional attractiveness as problematic, that probably happens anyways because like social media and beauty standards are like Instagram models have an incentive to like sell certain unrealistic standards on the both sides of the house. But all these are reasons why the discourse gets actively better on our side of the house as a comparative to what the discourse looks like on their side of the house. And I think this beats opening opposition genially. Finally though, I just want to like add like a separate impact in terms of enjoyment. Because here's the thing. I actually just think that like at the point where more people are able to like access this sort of like good depictions of sex, it's going to that women just see far more respectful and better portrayals of sexual pleasure on screen. And this is great because enjoyment is a very certain impact, right? Like when you see a degree of beauty for the first time, you need to realize things about yourself. You often find it really nice to look at sex, you feel pleasure that is good independently. For all these reasons, OG.
I then speak of those remarks and remind speakers to the points of information. I now invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Oxford!
If Hans thinks that Sydney Sweeney on Euphoria was a net negative for the production of themselves, he's genuinely fucking insane. We agree with them that the comparative is that what shapes discussion about sex is not the mainstream media. But unfortunately for them, not everyone is some 11-year-old Indian boy who's strangely obsessed with sex. Because what replaces the lack of discussion isn't just porn in the coffers of our bedroom. The case from closing opposition will be incredibly simple. We will explain at face value why less discussion perpetrated through mainstream media is a good thing, what are the alternatives, and how do we interact with concepts of sex, because it's not just porn, and Ola has actually explained what it is, and then we'll explain why specifically for younger populations, the harm is far more limited. On the comparative, I want to ask you right now, how do we construct our relationships with morally provocative things in a world where we don't have access to mainstream media that often glorifies it, or like Ensmutification and things like that? It is three sources. One is that the source that everyone's talking about, right, which is porn. But there's two other sources that people haven't talked about much, which is A, your lived experiences, your parents, your own relationships, the friends around you, and things like that. Second, it's formalized sources, things like sex education classes, and like things in school that help you learn about these things. And what I want to note about these other two sources is that oftentimes they are much more important in how we shape our interactions for two very simple reasons. The first is, as opening government identifies, these are the sources that it is okay to talk about, right? It is not okay for me to talk about porn normally with my friends, unless I'm in Hans's friend group or something. And as a consequence, but it is much easier for me to talk about, oh, my parents were talking the other day about like the birds and the bees, or like my parents were telling me the other day about how I should like take my girlfriend out for X thing or Y things. These are often the normalized routes by which you engage in these discussions, if it is the case that people want these discussions to happen in the first place. What are the characteristics of these other sources that influence the way we think? Actually, before that, the second reason is that because of the taboo that happens with like when there's no Ensmutification, that it's not normalized to talk about these things. There's also a separation that exists in people's minds, right? There's a separation between the part of you that is like sexually driven, that wants to consume things like porn, and the part of you that lives the daily life that can't talk about those other things, that needs to go out into the world and interact with the world and be a normal human being in the way that it presents itself to the world. What does this mean? Firstly, it means that at face value, that other part of you will no longer carry the things from that one part of you that everyone has, right? Like we watch porn in the corners of our bedroom alone, and then we go out and be normal human beings in the world. And that part of you, the part of you that goes out and becomes a normal human being, is much more likely to be influenced by society, by parents, and by formalized sources. So, why are these formalized sources, society, etc., much more likely to be good in terms of just minimizing the harms that they talk about in terms of harms to women, in terms of harms to mental health, and so on? Firstly, at face value, I think social taboos have a tendency to correct against the worst sorts of behavior. Because oftentimes, things that we taboo, and equally the things that our parents choose to espouse to us, tend to be reflections of what is the most morally correct thing to do in their perspective. It is likely that we just end up tabooing things that we think are just outright bad, right? So incel culture, for example, becomes a taboo in our world. Being dishonorable to your woman becomes a taboo in our world. Trying to be a breadwinner, even in conservative societies, is not something that conversely becomes more normalized in our world. So the discussions that you have at face value tend to make the harms they talk about really, really stigmatized. That's a good thing, because it means even if you think that you want to do those things, you have massive, massive social pressures to not do those things when these things are stigmatized. Stigma is actually a good thing. Second, and much more importantly, like there's regulation that happens in other types of formalized sources, right? Things like sex education classes and things like that have been broadly approved by a variety of boards and so on. And that process in and of itself means that when you're being taught these things, you're learning these things, are sanitized in a way that makes it so that you're not engaging in these types of conversations. So the conclusion of all of this is, first of all, the types of discussion that they talk about that you want to stigmatize because it's bad is just discussion that people don't want to engage in, right? Like the term incel is something that everyone around you says is like a shitty thing to be. Use it as an insult in our world. And as a consequence of that, you are just less likely to become an incel, even if you have sexual desires, right? That is the point. Like when Sydney Sweeney then instead, this is the comparative, I suppose, goes on Euphoria, and like this is the thing that people are consuming, and that is the normalization they want. That is what being an incel seems like a more normal thing to do, especially if you go on fucking social media, you go on your group chats and so on and have these discussions because that is the thing they want to normalize. The conclusion we're making, and this is pretty bloody Singaporean of us, is that it is good that we keep these things in the coffers of our bedroom. It is good that we separate these parts of our identity with the parts of our identity that we're able to morally police, and society is able to morally police. We should not normalize these things, and that normalization is disgusting and harmful, and actually that accesses the harms that opening opposition talks about. The harms to women, for example, in these discussions become more harmful, and so on. Second argument on young people, but before that.
So people obviously don't like talking about sex with their parents, and you do internalize the norms in porn, and you use that as the basis of discussions with your peers. Obviously, we don't say being an incel is okay. We say it's okay to talk about incel culture. So
this is a strange case, man, right? Because you're like, oh, porn is super taboo. We're not going to talk about it with some people. We'll talk about it with some other people, and we'll go and become incels anyways. No, because the other sources that other people are interacting with, like when they go talk to their fellow women, their sisters, for example, who tell them off for being gooners or whatever, like that makes those discussions much more difficult to do, right? Like that is our point. I think it's very straightforward. Just see the fact that you guys are gooners. I think you guys treat women really well. Right? Okay. Secondly, on young people. First, I don't know that even though young people have access to the internet, there are often massive guardrails just by nature of them being younger. A, they don't know about their niches. Like we all consumed pop music before we figured out I like Mazzy Star versus I like Low Tech or something, right? And second, to be honest, they don't know about porn. Like genuinely, like I think maybe, I don't know, like porn is really popular in boys' schools or something, but so many young people around the world just don't know about porn as this thing that exists. So oftentimes that means that youth consume like mainstream media as the main thing that they're consuming, as opposed to just like going and searching up porn at the age of 10 or something like that. So, and the second thing I'll point out is this media also gets glorified on their side of the house. Oftentimes notice that it is targeted towards you, right? Euphoria is set in high school up until season 3. And like that means that you think that it's something that is cool to watch and something that you relate with. But also, when you're entering rebellious phase as a child, you want to go and explore things that are like averse to your parents or rebellious and things like that. At that point is when mainstream media also then makes these things very accessible, that you go and consume these things. Why is this bad? Firstly, kids are naive, right? Like their interactions with things are much less likely to be nuanced than the average person's interactions. Like, so even if they want people to interact with these stories well, the average child doesn't watch Euphoria and think, wow, like this is such a nuanced story about drugs and whatnot. They think sex and drugs, that's cool or whatever, right? And then secondly, it means that it becomes harder to listen to the other sources that we identify. Because now there's a direct conflict in the kid's mind between their parents and whatnot. For all those reasons, I'm very proud to oppose.
Thanks for those remarks. And now I'm about to government play.
No chance. What's wrong with you guys?
Oxford! Sorry.
Every
So it's still something really stupid. I'm not sure if I should say that.
same.
You ever think like in the porn studio, some guys like, get a load of this guy.
That was awful.
That's the end of
We'll consider.
Alright, let's do something slightly better. Alright, why do people enjoy joking in that? This might be a mysterious question to some, but I genuinely think it is an intimate and actually quite valuable discussion. But for a lot of people, the reason why they enjoy it is that life and the stresses therein is a burden. And in the act of choking, they surrender that control. They surrender some of that burden they place on themselves to plan their own lives, to control everything in them. And in that, there is great liberation and great value. Sexual preferences are massively diverse. They have to do with your upbringing, your first experiences, your biological wants. And because they are so random, we need a quality and we need breadth and we need nuance in how these things are discussed. And I want to preempt anything which says, these aren't relevant. Now, these obviously really matter. Like sexual connection, understanding of intimacy, and importantly, understanding of love and preferences are, I think, a core way you can relate to people. Understanding that casual sex doesn't feel right for you, that it erodes your soul, that it makes you feel like trash when you do it, and it makes you unable to love others, is something you should realize sooner rather than later if you are that sort of person. So I do think there's immense value in the things of exploration we are talking about. First, let's engage with closing opposition. Gareth, listen up. They said several things, and that is where they believe. First, they say that there are other things with which we discuss more provocative things, like your lived experiences, sex ed, etc. But obviously these lack specificity in nuance and specific expression. I don't know of any sex ed curriculum which discusses kinks, which discusses preferences. In the vast majority of cases, they will discuss at most safety, not like sexual minority exploration, not any other relevant things they lack. Second, most people's first interactions don't actually engage with what they want. They are just a sort of medium of what they expect that to be, which means the, habits and understandings they have from porn, older siblings, etc. matter. Second, the last bit of their speech is that, young people won't be exposed to these things, and it's good to not be exposed to these things. Guys, what? Like, several obvious reasons to why I said that young people start thinking about sex. And this discussion. First of all, at some point they'll get a boner and be like, huh? And then they need to do something with it, right? Second, they like be on social media and see like some Instagram model in a bikini and be like, ooh, boobies. And then they start getting some thoughts. So obviously these thoughts lead them somewhere. Lastly, older brothers exist. I have two of them. Lovely bunch of you. What does this mean? I think that part of their case doesn't actually change anything. The last thing they have is that it's actually a good idea to have taboos. Because they say taboos are good and they run this practically thing. 3 problems with taboos. First and most obviously, they're incredibly anachronistic. They tend to be primarily enforced and primarily motivated by older institutions, religion, old people, which means just generally are oftentimes good. They are misinformed. They have too conservative ideas. And I do genuinely think this. These are the sort of people who tell you that being gay is a sin. And I have very liberal opinions on the moral value of being gay. I think it's actually pretty okay all things considered. Secondly, they are incredibly paternalistic because there is value in things others can understand. Most people cannot understand why an act like bondage is of value to you, but if that is something you relate to it, if that is something which makes you feel freer, which makes you feel like you're enjoying what you're doing, that is something someone else has to understand. And that is why taboo misinforms and misses the mark of what works for you. Lastly, taboos are sometimes worse because they lead to the highway, right? They will, there being a taboo of something and that taboo existing means that in the inevitable case it happens, and this will still, broadly happen. The elasticity of demand for choking is quite low, fun micro fact. That means that if it still happens, the difference is how often this can be discussed, how much you can discuss with your friends when you got bruises, or the difference between choking arteries and choking the windpipe, which is a relevant safety consideration. What was then our extension, and why is it relevant? What we explained to you is that the majority of consumption is exploratory rather than, grooming, which was what OG identifies. And there are several reasons why ours is a much more relevant demographic. First of all, many people don't go to this material because they're committed to the plot. Right, so even when the sex happens, the plot is still interesting, so let me lock in. Second, obvious capacity constraints. You're in the cinema, you're in the living room TV. Alright, so we're those. Third of all, as we explained, the comparative advantage is emotional appeal. That is to say that they don't watch it going into that. The relevant question then is how and where do you explore your identity? And what Leo gives you an explanation is why the people who consume this media, in the vast majority of instances, do this as a way of exploring their sexual identity. So the question is, where do you explore your desires, and is porn just fun? Because under our side, people will still probably watch porn, because it's like, the question is, why do they watch it, what is their motivation, and the process they do this. Several reasons then as to why we have benefits from it. First of all, the consumption of porn is healthier, because you don't feel the need to explore your identity through the consumption of pornography, which means that many good things. First of all, you feel less of a reason to click at other things you might not have thought of. And porn, because of how desensitized it is, because of how perverted it is in an industry, likely exaggerates things, which means the choking you see in porn vastly worse and vastly more dangerous than the type of things you would actually experience IRL. Second of all, you're less prone to an algorithm, and the porn algorithm, as the Instagram algorithm, for instance, tends to want to promote more extreme things, keep you invested for more, show you new things, which means it might start creating preferences which are violent, preferences which are antisocial, preferences which might not fully understand, and therefore want to try and bet actually it's dangerous. These are much bigger problems than the one government identifies. No.
I'm confused. How can you explore your niche kink of choking through watching 2.5 hours of Wuthering Heights?
I'm not sure, I haven't watched Wuthering Heights. But what I can tell you is that you can very realistically understand how a trans person feels engaging in sexual intercourse when you watch Euphoria, and there are several points about this. You can understand the concept of a relationship and the power dynamic between an older and a younger person when you see that explored, because the nuance therein is much higher. I'm sure Hans can tell you of a movie which has choking if you really feel the need to watch that afterwards. The question then the opening opposition poses to us is, why is this good if it's dominated by white men? That is incredibly reductive, because ethnicity, race, identity is only a small and tiny part of the rich patchwork which is humanity. It is reductive to say that you don't relate with someone else's desires because they look different from you. I genuinely reject this. I genuinely think it is demeaning to say that an Asian person can't relate to the sexual desires of a white person. Me and Hans have had so many interesting discussions about this subject matter. The other relevant question is this a comparative one? Because porn is an avenue where these things are fetishized and where these people have even less control. So the nuance found in our media is much better. Lastly, I think we can actually much better explore sexual identity. And there is nuance here, right? Because most people who watch Euphoria are like 16, 17, and they do discuss these things. I would think it's like 11-year-old which watch these things, you know, they probably be watching porn because it's like simpler, right? So what does this mean? We think there's a level of nuance, there's a level of understanding, there's a discussion of a much broader part of the experience, the aftercare, what goes into it, more different types of relationships. I know things small, and I know we've made a lot of sex jokes, but this is genuinely a very important development for allowing people to live a good life.
Those remarks, and now to conclude the round, I invite the opposition board.
Gareth.
This could be the World Cup final.
Oxford!
Come on.
CEO's winning ground is that Ensmutification is worse for its audience than the comparative. We tell you three things under this. The first is that the alternative for most people is not porn, especially when you are younger and especially in terms of things you talk about. Second, that we should not normalize things that are in Ensmutification, and it promotes bad conversations like incel culture. And third, that this media is really harmful for a huge part of its audience that are young and impressionable people. Let's give some responses. The first thing he says is that, oh, sex ed and things like that lack specificity in kinks. That's fine. Like, if the harm we have to buy is that most people are going to have vanilla protected sex until they're a bit older, until they know what they're doing, and then they explore joking, fine, we bite that harm. The harm of the comparative is that your first introduction to what sex is something that is really kinky, is something that is really niche. You don't know that it's something that is kinky and not everyone is into. You might think that the first time you have sex, just because your partner consented to sex, they consented to choking, which leads to really, really bad harms because you don't know that that's something that is kinky and not something that is mainstream. So on the comparative, we think it is fine if you have this kind of exploration at an early stage. Second, Max says taboos are anachronistic. They're motivated by old people, they're paternalistic, etc., etc. The first thing to note is that, like, this stock analysis doesn't really apply in this debate, right? Like, because the people you talk to about sex aren't really religious leaders. It isn't often your grandparents. It is people who tend to be more liberal in society. Even if you talk about education boards and things like that, the people who teach sex ed, either on social media, or in schools, or in mainstream media, these are the people who tend to be more liberal about these ideas. These are the least likely to be anachronistic and paternalistic. But second, there are just other reasons why social change happens. Like, I think the kinds of paternalistic groups that they're talking about are the least likely to be the ones who are watching this kind of Ensmutified content. If you are someone who is going to be watching this kind of content, you are likely to be someone who is already on that wave of social change. It's someone who is likely to be unpaternalistic about these taboos. But the third thing I want to say just on weighing is that if we are extra conservative about sex, like maybe a bit too Singaporean here, but if we're like, even if we err on the side of conservatism, that's probably a good thing. If young people are having less sex, if they're having more safe sex, if they are not, if they are more conservative about things like consent, for example, we are very happy to err on the side of conservatism. The final thing they say is that young people start thinking about sex anyways. But I think this is like deeply unresponsive to the nuance that Tanush gives you, which is that there is a big difference from thinking about it and watching it in the mainstream, from it becoming normalized, from having to like go and search for porn and get past all the age restrictions and things like that. It takes a very concerted effort, and only if you're already someone who wants to do that, you do it. And the comparative is you go on Netflix and it's just there. There's just what people are talking about at break in school. It is normalized, and that's your view of what a high school is like Euphoria. That is why it's incredibly harmful. It is not like people think about sex on both sides of the house, but the level to which they think about sex, the level to which sex is normalized in a young person's life is vastly different. That is the nuance of Tanush's case that they don't explain to you. In the face of all of this, I think Steve has proven to you that it is far better than it's far worse than the comparative. I think the only winning ground for either gov team is that porn is worse than that's a comparative. So that's the main thing I want to deal with. I want that both these teams say that you substitute this for porn, so this damages both of them. I have three things to say about this, and this is like even if you know all about attention. The first flip is that this makes people watch porn more, because that's how dopamine receptors work. Once you get a little bit, you want more and more. And it takes more and more stimulation to give you the same dopamine hit. That is why people go down a rabbit hole of being introduced to things and then watching slightly more extreme, slightly more explicit content. And on their side of the house, when more people are introduced to the idea of sex, nudity, watching explicit things at a young age, that is when to get that same dopamine hit. People chase that down the rabbit hole. They are more likely to watch porn on their side of the house. This is not just like it happens anyways. It happens more on their side of the house. It is worse for porn on their side. Second response, and again this is a flip, because Ensmutification shifts the baseline of what is normalized. Because now, when things are not so explicit, or like the most sexualized thing is like Megan Fox and Transformers, porn seems very far off. It seems really deviant. But when what is normalized, things like heated rivalry or Euphoria, porn doesn't seem that different from that. When the baseline is shifted to these things being normalized, porn seems like a very natural next step. So again, even if you know the early analysis, you get more people watching porn on their side of the house because it is closer to the baseline of what they deem as normal. The third thing I just want to say about this is porn is just more restricted. Like it's banned in Singapore. In the UK, you've got to get through the whatever age verification. Friend told me. So like compared to something that's far more accessible, right? I think you create like a whole new group of gooners on their side of the house who wouldn't have watched porn on a comparative. These are really important flips. Not only is this the main winning ground of CG that people substitute this for porn, it is the OG analysis that people watch more porn on the gov. Before I go on to what the gov bench have left. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so even if you accept the bizarre lie that Singaporeans don't watch porn, which if you met any of them, is highly dubious. Ensmutification bad. There are many people who do watch porn, and Ensmutification presents an alternative.
Yeah. This like refer to the last 2 minutes of my speech. Like this is not an alternative. They want more porn on your side of the house. Let's talk about what the gov bench have left. Let's talk about CG, right? The reasons that Leo gives you shows that it fulfills a very different need from porn. Right? Like most people skip the storyline, guys. I think when you make it all storyline, this is a very good POI here. When you make it all storyline, it's obviously going to fulfill a different need. I don't think it's going to replace it at all. Next, Leo says that this is good for LGBT individuals because it's more represented. Flip. Now the dominant societal conception of what a gay relationship isn't two men holding hands in love. It's heated rivalry where they fuck all the time. It seems more taboo, more deviant, more base. This is bad for LGBT representation in the rest of the society. Finally, note that I don't think they get the kind of exploration that Max wants to talk about, because Hollywood often appeals to the lowest common denominator. They don't want to represent niche things because it's really risky for them. They want to get the most views. They want to appeal to the most common things, and therefore we don't get the kind of exploration. I don't think CG has much apart from that. The last thing we want to deal with from OG is about changing sexual norms. My first flip to this is that these are bad norms to perpetuate, because the problem is that respectful, consensual, protected sex isn't what's depicted in these shows because it's not dramatic. There's a big missing burden in opening government because they say it's better than porn, but not why these are good norms. Like, you know watching the rivalry, right? Someone jerking off you in the shower in front of you without your consent is not a good norm. That is not what we should perpetuate. There is no analysis in 14 minutes of OG as to why these norms are not just better than porn, but good as a whole. We tell you that we shouldn't perpetuate these at all. I think this splits what I think this splits the OG argument about perpetuating norms. Weighing over O, I think the reason is simple. We're just more charitable, right? Like there's lots of Ensmutification in Asia. It's not just white men. Our argument applies to the entire spectrum, not just the it will be done badly. It's a clean CEO,
I think speaks to the smarts and all speakers for an excellent debate. Let's do another round of applause. Invite you guys to step out. You will get the poll in the poll. Oh yeah, if anyone no longer wants their recording to be published on the internet, which you know is fair, just let Audrey know.
Do you guys want to go front with that?
Yeah.
Sorry, man.
All good, all good.
Wait,
You know.
Yes. No, I'm happy with my speech.
I'm very surprised when we the fight
Yeah.
Unless you'd like to say that.
Thanks, go back.
What if we're in front of the comments?
Nice extra.